Now, back to the UK, because Keir Starmer is under mounting pressure to scrap the two-child benefit cap from some in his own party, from the SNP, even from Nigel Farage. And the SNP has today said it will table an amendment to the King's speech to end the cap. I spoke to the SNP's Stephen Gethins earlier. So you want to scrap the two-child cap on benefits. What's your reasoning and what are you going to do about it?
Well, this is something that the SNP have been campaigning on since 2015. This isn't something new. We know that the two-child cap is driving child poverty, with that growth in poverty of families 3 and above. Now, the Scottish Government's already taken significant action on child poverty, but maybe it's time for Westminster to take a little bit of the strain as well. We know it's driving policy. This is a simple measure that the incoming government could take, and that's why we're trying to work with other parties on removing that cap.
I asked Wes Streeting about this on the programme last week. He said that people need to bear with the government on this, that they'll effectively do it when they can afford to do it. So it's estimated to cost about £1.7 billion a year to remove the cap. How would you pay for it?
Well, look, the Scottish Government is already paying to take 100,000 children out of poverty by having a slightly more...
I'm talking specifically about Westminster here, because that's what you're calling on the Westminster Government to do.
Yes. Look, if we look at 1.7 billion, we already know that the public exchequer is being hit by Brexit because of the lack of economic growth. We already know that we've got a less progressive taxation system in Scotland. So 1.7 billion in terms is a small part of the welfare budget. I think it would be a good thing for an incoming Labour government to do. It's something that Scottish Labour have indicated that they would support. So I'd like them to put their money where their mouth is and maybe support this measure and get in behind the SNP.
Just to come in, if I may, I accept that it's a small part of the total government spending budget or even the welfare budget. But if you want to do it, then isn't it responsible to say exactly how you'd pay for it? Or is it something that you think that actually they can increase borrowing by 1.7 billion to do?
Sorry, Sophie, you could increase borrowing. You could also, like Scotland, have a slightly more progressive taxation system where those lower wages in Scotland pay less tax, those in higher wages pay more tax. So there's a lot. Look, I think everybody can learn from each other, but there's a lot in terms of what the Scottish Government's been doing in recent years that Westminster could learn from. And child poverty is one of these things. We're not just talking about a Westminster game here. We're talking about the way in which, kids that will go hungry. How do you heat a house going into the winter time? We know it's having a significant impact already. And I'm pleased to see that you're already seeing some Labour MPs who have indicated that they would support this SNP measure. So if some Labour MPs are getting in behind it, we've set out ways that you can pay for it, then why can't the government as a whole? It's a pretty simple measure, a pretty straightforward measure. And in the wider scheme of things, it's a small part of the budget. Let's put it this way in terms of perspective. Leaving the EU has already cost us £140 billion. A replacement for Trident will cost £200 billion. And you're talking about £1.5 billion in terms of child poverty. Politics is about choices, it's about priorities, and we think child poverty should be a priority.
I guess, slightly painful truth is that you'd probably have more influence in Westminster on votes and things like that if you hadn't got absolutely hammered at the election. Only 9 MPs. And I guess the problem now is, why should people listen to what you've got to say? Well,
you're right. The SNP didn't have a great result. Part of that is the vagaries of the election system, whereby the SNP got 30% and had significant reduction in its MPs. Labour got 33% and had a landslide. They're the vagaries of the system. But I've been elected by...
Voters were trying to send you a message, though, weren't they? What message do you think they were trying to send?
I think they were sending us a message to do things better, to prioritise. I think things like the cost of living. I don't think they were sending us a message to take our foot off the gas when it came to issues like child poverty, though. Maybe I'm wrong, but very much my impression was when I was speaking to people, they liked what was happening on child poverty. It was something that was in the manifesto on which I was elected. And I think that has to be a priority. Now, you're right, the SNP didn't have a great night, and we've got to reflect on that. But that will not stop me, and it will not stop my colleagues prioritising these kind of issues, which we think are important. And it's not just important to us, we're seeing that with other colleagues as well from other political parties.
Just finally, because I completely get your passion on the two-child benefit, and I'm sure many of our viewers were listening, sort of cheering at the TVs at it. But you were saying that the SNP needs to reflect on the election result, and I guess putting the child benefit issue to one side, what do you think the SNP is going to change going forward after that election result?
Well, look, just first of all, on that two-child cap, Scottish Labour said that they'd back it. Now, Scottish Labour had a good night. I'm not going to deny that, but they said they backed it. And one thing that when you get elected in politics is implement the things that you say that you're going to back, even when that's difficult.
I've asked a very
I hope our
open
Scottish
question
Labour
here
colleagues
about
will come
what
out.
the
But I
SNP
think-
are reflecting on after the election. You're talking about Scottish
Sure.
Labour. With respect, we spent a lot of time talking about child benefit, but just finally, what will the SNP change after that election result?
But I think it was also important to answer the point that you raised, Sophie, as well. So, and on the point about the SNP, I think we need to listen. One of the things that I think that you do after an election is I like to chat doors and speak to people. I think we need to reflect on how we're tackling priorities like the cost of living crisis, how we're taking on other issues. How do we take forward the case for independence? What does the Scottish Government do? I think the work it's doing on issues like tackling the cost of living crisis and on child poverty, for example, is the right way forward. And we know in issues like Brexit and austerity that we are on the right side of public opinion. But I think as a party, we've got some reflecting to do. But often politics doesn't give you that much time. And that's why with the King's speech coming up, we had to lay an amendment. And I think this is the right subject to be prioritising just now.
OK, thank you very much indeed. Good to have you on the programme.
Thank you.